So where I left this off, I had the two linear actuators moving the carriages separately, and now it was time to connect them with essentially an inner apron that will also double as reinforcement for the tabletop when it is lifted. So I've been making these inner parts out of walnut because when you see how I built the tabletop, you'll see it will have a walnut strip in the center. I kind of wanted to continue that across the piece, but I didn't have enough walnut to make this central apron. But I did have a nicer piece of cherry. So it was it wasn't as wide as I needed, but I can make it work for this. The problem with these nicer veneered pieces of lumber is you usually have to buy them in pretty big sheets, and they're quite expensive. So I opted to use the material I had lying around, and you don't really see this apron unless the table's raised, and even then it doesn't look out of place with it being cherry, so it ended up working out. But basically I cut this down to rough width and length. You can see I have it lined up with where I need to cut the lap on the cherry. It's really important that I don't make these too long. I was concerned about forcing the carriage out of dimension by adding this inner piece, so I was pretty careful with cutting it as I went so I didn't make it too long or too short, obviously too short being a major problem. So I lined it up and I started cutting this lap joint. It's basically I have a stop on the radial arm saw. I'm going to cut a series of curves, and that's how I'll remove that material. If you remember correctly from the carriage, I have the mirroring lap joint already cut on the carriage. This is the one that will slide into place. This is a very, very sturdy joint. You multiply the gluing surface when you have a lap like this. I've seen a couple tests of people doing strength tests for joints, and lap joints usually end up being one of the strongest, usually beating out mortise and tenons. So I like to use them a lot when I'm building, especially when you won't see them because they're not as pretty as some of the other joints, but they're extremely strong. So you see how this will line up with that carriage, and now these two carriages and this apron will be one unit. I could slide the back piece in place. You kind of see as I'm hammering this in place what I meant by don't want to force it out of dimension. And then I can test out the table, make sure that there's no grinding or anything with the linear actuator. And the problem I was having was that now this is all together, I was having problems with the trestles lifting. So I kind of begrudgingly decided to glue together the base of the table. One of the reasons I was putting this off is to make any changes if I needed to as things arose or problems arose. It's much easier to do it when these pieces are apart than together, but it kind of got to the point where I had to glue them together. So after they were glued together, I retested the carriages and they were binding a little bit, and you could see by gluing it, it made my groove a little off. So all I did is a hair off at the top, and I just went through with a saw and trimmed off that little bit of material. I believe this was only a problem on one of the trestles, and then I could get that carriage working again. So at this point the trestles are glued together, both of the carriages still slide pretty smoothly in their grooves, and then I could continue gluing together the rest of the base. Like I said, at this point I was kind of hoping to keep it separate till the end, but I ended up gluing it together just because I couldn't get the pieces were starting to move with one another essentially. So you could see the bottom stretchers. I'm just going to add a bunch of glue, mortise and tenons, glue that in place and clamp it in place, and then I'll also do the top aprons, and then the base will now function as one solid piece. I prefer to do solid joints like this, especially on movable parts. I know some people use hardware and whatnot, but this will always be sturdier, and this isn't a super wide or long table, so I can lift and carry this without the tabletop on it without a problem. So there's the aprons in place as well. I let all this stuff set up overnight, and then I could, before I let it set up, anytime I glue something, I always make sure it works before the glue sets up. If I went to test this out and it wasn't going to move, it's not going to move once the glue's dry, and then you have a real problem. So like I said, I tested to make sure everything would work, and then I clamped it and let everything dry overnight. Could come in the next morning, remove all the clamps, and then I could start fleshing out the rest of this apron. So now that everything is glued, I could put the initial runners back in place. this cherry was a little bowed because I've had it in my shop for quite a while, so that's what that central clamp is. It's making it straight, and then I could test this again, and I was pretty happy. I had no binding or anything like that. The linear actuator sounded good, and I could raise this up to the point I think it will most likely be used at. Could shake it. The only thing moving is the table base. This is really solid, so at this point I was pretty happy with the progress, and I could continue working on the apron, knowing that it's going to function at least up until this point. So one of the problems was, like I said, I'm building this for someone who's fairly tall, and as I'm raising my legs, they're kind of touching the base of the apron. So to add a little bit of aesthetics to the piece, I decided to cut a curve out of the bottom, and I'm also going to put some cross members on this so it helps hold up the top. So basically what I have marked out is what's past the linear actuator and where I'm going to put some cross members, and then I can mark a curve in between those two markings and cut that out. Like I said, I will eventually have plans for this, so all those dimensions will be in there. I have a roll of baling wire that I just used to mark pretty much all of my curves. It works pretty easily, and then I could just cut this out. This was actually a nice addition. Not only was it going to give more leg space, but it makes the table look a little bit nicer than just having this flat piece of cherry right in the center of the table. I used a jigsaw to cut this out, and then I don't think I show footage of it, but I used a sander to clean out that curve. And obviously I'm doing this on both pieces. So here's some footage of the belt sander, because that jigsaw doesn't leave a nice clean cut. And that's basically how I finish that off. And then I will there's going to be a lot of edge banding on this inner apron, so that will be once aproned with cherry, the edge banded with cherry once I'm done. So then for the inside, I wanted a flat bottom, not only to hold the electronics, but to also keep this true. As you could see, I said it was bending. So I'm putting a dado in between my marks there. So I lowered the blade, I lowered the piece onto the blade, and then I could cut that dado. I'm going to do both of them. This is, I believe, a 1/2-inch dado because I used 1/2-inch material in between here. So that's all that dado is. You're not going to see this. It's on the inside of the apron. So I marked it. You can see I went through my marks on either side because that's where I want it. And then I could go through and cut the cross members for, this will make more sense once you see the cross members I'm putting in there. But like I said in a previous version of this, I usually kind of incrementally make these dado cuts because the blowout on the back side is usually quite severe. But I wanted to cut these pretty quickly. And like I said, the side facing away from the camera is the inside of the carriage. So if there is blowout, it's something you'll never see because this is going to be covered by the tabletop. So I decided to cut these in one go. You can see I have to cut, I have the 1/2-inch dado stack still in there from the previous cut. Instead of switching it out, I just decided to make two separate cuts. And then I could remove my fence and make the cuts on this side. So like I said, the blowout will all be contained to the inner portion of it. The one huge downside of this nicer veneered material is the veneer is extremely thin, and even looking at it sometimes it chips away, and then you have some patching to do. So once it was back in place, you could see if I raise up my legs on my tippy toes, I'm not touching the apron, which is what I wanted. And then I could go through and just measure and cut this inner piece that will hold the two sides together. So this is just leftover the birch veneer. Like I said, I'm pretty sure this was 1/2-inch, didn't need to be super thick. And you could see the blowout on some of those pieces I have. And I could slide this apron out, clamp it together, and put it back in place. And now those cuts for the cross members probably make a little more sense. You could see I just made sure nothing would interfere with the linear actuators, and then I had enough walnut to make the cross members out of walnut. And originally I was going to put the switch at the edge of one of these. I decided not to later in the video because I didn't think you'd be able to use it. But basically this is pretty simple stuff. I have these cross members in here, and this is what I'll attach the tabletop to. So now you have a very substantial piece of woodworking in the middle of the table that's kind of hidden by the aprons when it's down, but this will hold up the whole top when it's raised in the air. The only problem at this point is I need to cut some grooves to run some wires. So that's what this is. I have them all stacked. I'm just going to cut a little bit of a dado out of the top side so I could run all the wires. I wanted them to be pretty hidden and concealed with this, but if you take the tabletop off, you can still access them. Being able to fix this if something goes wrong, replace parts if something goes wrong was really important to me. So that's why I spent the extra time to make a lot of these pieces hollow and accessible. So then the bases of these, I wanted them enclosed as well. So with the same walnut material, I'm just cutting some base pieces, and then I could glue most of this together. So that's just the base. And then I'll have caps for the front, which I think will be in the next video. So at this point, like I said, I thought I was going to be running some wires through the arms, so I did cut a little groove off of the top for that. Like I said, I think I don't think I end up using these. You'll see in a later video why. But then at this point, I can glue this all together as well. So once again, I'm going to glue the base together, glue all the cross members in, and then this will be an extremely strong piece because then it will also be glued to the carriages that are already there. I can't remember if I do that at this point or not. I think at this point I just glued all the cross members together, but I'm sure I'll correct myself in the footage if I did not. And then I could just clamp this together, slide everything in place. It looks like at this point I'm not gluing those in there. And then you can see I have a little cutout on the back for some wires. And then, like I said, I could clamp this all together because that cherry is bowed. And then I could add the cross members, glue those in place as well. And that will be the basis for the apron. There's a little bit more work I will do on this, which will be in a later video, but this was the bulk of the build for this. And then adding the pieces on the bottom as well, all at once. Obviously you want this stuff to be pretty square, but it's not as important as the exterior base. The tabletop will be connected to this inner portion. It will not be connected to the outer structure of the base. And then that is what it looks like when it's all glued together. You could see the cutouts I made for the wires. So the linear actuators, their power cords will go through those two ends. And then, like I said, I'll have caps for these and I'll veneer everything. Tried to remove some of the glue as I went so I didn't have to chip it off this piece. And that is basically what that looks like. And once again, before everything dries, I'm going to make sure it works. It would be not catastrophic, but not great if I came in the next morning and nothing worked once the glue dried. But if I went to go raise this up and nothing was working, I can take it apart, clean off the glue, and make changes before everything's set up. But I could raise and lower it, and it worked quite well. And then at this point, I think I'm going to stop this video, and then next week might be the last part, finishing this up.